Hey, Colby, how are you?
Hi, Kristen. All things considered, I think I'm doing really well. I think.
All things
I think.
considered, I think we have to preface, like pandemic wise, I'm okay.
Yeah, it's a
Normal
new
life
scale.
wise, yeah, it's
It's
a
a
new
n-
scale. Well, it's a new scale and it's a new, I don't know, I'm finding it has to be a sort of new standards. Like, my productivity is not going to be the same as before. My outfits are not going to be, like, everything is like a
uh,
lower
yeah,
bar.
yeah. Which has been hard for me, to be honest with you. Like the whole productivity thing, because I think we share the same Enneagram type, right? Do you identify type three? Yes.
I'm a
Okay.
three. Yeah.
So much of our
Yes.
sense of well-being and worth and value is
Yes.
wrapped up, for better or for worse. Like that's who we are, so we love that part of us. But
Yeah,
also, for worse, it's wrapped up in our productivity and how
it
much we
is.
achieve and what we get done in a day. And that's being real tested right now because I
Yeah.
feel so unproductive.
I do too. I do too. And I'm, yeah, struggling with insomnia, which means
Oh
like a lot of
no.
the hours that I have available to me, I'm just laying in bed but not being productive, and
That
well, and
sounds
then
horrible.
you have the same amount of children that I do.
Yeah, for some
And
reason we chose
yeah,
four.
why
Like
did you do
why?
that?
Why? Yeah.
And so they're all at home with you up in your space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have been a little bit prepared for this only insofar as we've homeschooled um,
Mm-hmm.
our kids for the last multiple numbers of years.
Yeah.
Our oldest started high school this year, so he's actually been in a school. So
Mm-hmm.
he's having the hardest transition here. But my point is as a family unit, we're more or less accustomed to the six of us
Yeah.
together for long periods of times.
Yeah.
Still, we're finding the edges of each other's sanity bubbles
Oh,
more than
sure.
ever. But
Yeah. Yeah, it's different.
yeah,
Well, Kobe, I'm trying to think of how you and I initially met. I mean, did we meet through the beer and hymns thing?
no, it was before that.
When?
Yeah, so Kate and I, my wife, Kate and
Yeah.
I, we started our church,
Yes.
Sojourn Grace Collective in San Diego, in
Yes.
the spring of 2014. And I don't know
And
what
I
happened
came and
between
visited
you
the
came and
church.
visited. Yes, you and your
Yes.
family like drove
We
down to
did.
come, and at that time we were still meeting in our living room. So you came like into our house
I
church in
did.
the early days,
That's
and then
right.
our families went out afterwards, went to Balboa Park, and walked around and had lunch together.
That's
But
right.
I don't know that I remember how or why you found our church in San Diego. I think you were just desperate for some sort of progressive-ish community, right? And you're
I
like,
was.
the
And what's
closest
funny
one is
is
2 hours away or whatever the drive
yes. I
is.
mean, this is exactly what we're going to talk about as we sort of
Yeah.
talk about how we each had this theme in our book, but I was. I we had there was no I don't know how to say it politely, but there were no progressive churches in Orange County that were not mostly 70, 80-year olds,
Sure.
which is
Sure.
fine,
Yep.
but we were not finding anyone our age or closer to our age. You're younger than me, but closer to our age, um, that were like worshiping in a way that we wanted to worship.
Yeah.
And also I have found this weird paradox where churches that are progressive theologically seem to be the most regressive in terms of forms of worship, like the practice of worship. Do you know what I mean by that? Like,
Totally. Yep.
it's like, okay, well, it's like we're totally progressive theologically, but we're still going to sing 2,000-year-old hymns out of a hymnal wearing
Yeah.
robes.
Yeah.
And I guess I wanted to have it all. Like, I wanted a progressive theology and what felt like a modern worship experience. And you guys are one of the few churches I've ever been to that are doing that. Why,
Yeah.
Colby? Why?
You you are describing a phenomenon that is real, and
Yeah,
yeah, in my first book, Unclobber, I called it a unicorn church, just because I was
yeah.
trying to name that exact phenomenon.
It was a unicorn church.
Yes, yes. This theology that is open and inclusive, and yet the praxis, sort of
Hmm.
the way that the church oriented itself, had this 21st century feel
Yeah.
to it. I think there's a lot of reasons why you're noticing the correlation a lot of the churches that are more affirming and open are Episcopal,
Yeah.
Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ.
Hmm.
So these are just more, I'll say stuck in the past sort of stylistically, but
They're
they were able to,
traditional. They're very
they're traditional.
traditional. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a I think a more apropos way to put it. But I think, well, yeah, I mean, we can get into it and we can just dive into this idea of church and as progressives. And I think part of the reasons why there are so few, well, there's a couple of reasons why there's so few of these unicorn churches is because a lot of the people who find themselves shifting out of conservative theology and away from their more maybe evangelical roots, they shift right on out of the church altogether. And
Right.
for really good reasons. So for
Right.
really good reasons, the church has harmed them. Religious leaders have been cruel to them. And so they have all good reasons why they leave. But then then there's really not any critical mass of humans that are still interested in doing this local church thing. And so
Yeah.
even though I'm familiar over the last 6 years, I've known a lot of pastors and leaders who've tried to start a unicorn type church. They just haven't had the people and the support
Yeah.
to be able to do it. And so these things start and they might last for 18 months or 2 years, and then they just dissipate because there's not a critical mass. And again, it makes sense. People are, I don't know, when you get kicked out of your conservative roots or you leave because that no longer makes sense.
Hmm.
Yeah, sometimes the idea of returning back to church feels for many people
Yeah.
like a really bad idea. And I affirm
Well,
that.
and I think, that's why I think this whole beer and hymns thing has found some traction
Yeah.
because for those people who have felt harmed by church, don't want to walk back into a church, you and I both do beer and hymns in our own communities, and just to be able to walk into a bar and immediately that sort of takes away some of the pretense,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
this is a
Yeah.
bar, I can have a drink. This milieu feels more comfortable to me than the church setting. And then to kind of have a re-experience of some of those sacred songs that a lot of us grew up on, and to have it in a new and fresh way with new and fresh people, can be a really spiritual and reconnecting experience, I
I
think,
love it.
for
Yeah.
people. So what's fun about our relationship is you were at our original Orange County Beer and Hymns. You
That's
were one of
right.
our kind of founding musicians. You came up and played with us for our first gig, which was super fun.
It was such a blast.
And then, at Wild Goose, we get to do beer and hymns there too.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to talk with you. I mean, it's funny that we naturally sort of we fell into this conversation already, just as we're saying, hey, but the intent of this series is to look at books and find a little common thread in two different books that maybe on the outside seem really different. And I wrote a humor and parenting book, and you wrote a book about this shift, kind of deconstruction of faith. So I would love for you to read a little excerpt, and then I'm going to read a little excerpt, and then we're going to chat through these common experiences.
I love it. All right. Should I jump
Go for
in?
it. Yeah.
Okay. So this is from The Shift,
Which is
Surviving
such a
and
good book.
Thriving. Oh, thank you.
Look at you. You're like matching your shirt and your walls to your book.
This is next level. Next level nerddom. We painted our house to brand it
touch the
for the
book.
book launch. Yeah.
Obviously.
Is that too much to ask for?
No.
What else are you going to do during quarantine? Repaint the house. Okay. So this is from chapter 7, which is titled, I Can't Stand Church. Where can I find one? And it's about what to do with your love-hate relationship with church. And I open it by saying this. Some call me the Sherlock Holmes of progressive Christianity. Okay, fine. No one has ever really called me that. But still, like Holmes, knowing that John Watson is a wounded Afghanistan war doctor, though at least partly psychosomatic, who is in therapy and at odds with his alcoholic brother merely by observing his appearance, his gait, his cell phone, and his speech pattern, I've learned to recognize the signs of those who've experienced suffering at the hands of church and religion. New people show up to our church every Sunday, desperate for a safe place to be seen and loved. And taking a sizable risk, they walk through the doors, daring to hope for a different kind of faith community. They often show up late, planning to just slide in the back, unaware that no one at our church ever shows up on time, so arriving 15 minutes late probably still makes you early. And they bob and weave through the various volunteers, extending hospitality through hugs and handshakes, making eye contact only long enough so as to not appear rude. If they have kids, they might huddle in the back of the room, arms containing their sons and daughters like a hen protecting their chicks. They hope for a church that their children might grow in, and yet need it to be so different from those of their youth. Exhaustion leaks from each timid step as they eventually perch on the edge of a seat near the exit just in case. Maybe they stand when the music starts, maybe not. They want to sing along, but they also can't stomach it. Church music seems just one of many instigators of conflicting emotions when people try out church again for the first time after their shift. And there they sit, surrounded by people laughing or hugging or crying or otherwise honestly reflecting whatever state they're in, because at our church, Sojourn, we aim to shed all pretense. But they can't participate in such authenticity. Of course not. How could they? No matter how hard churches try, the temptation to show up in a Sunday smile, insisting you're good and everything is fine, it permeates every assembly, congregation, and cathedral. It will take a while before they believe that they are human, like everyone else, and that such a state is, quote, supremely good, Genesis 1:31. After all, they've spent years in a codependent relationship with God, anxiously trying to manage God's feelings, desperate each day for the good cop God. And they've never fully felt loved because in the back of their mind, they're haunted by the echoes of preachers gone by that say, quote, God cannot stand the sight of you because of your sin. And so when I, or my wife and co-pastor Kate, stand up and insist, you are a loved child of God, full stop, they cock their head to the side like a curious dog, brow furrowed, drenched in skepticism. I've seen it 100 times, and it makes so much sense.
Man, that resonates, Colby.
Yeah.
I loved your book so much, and I just felt like it was my story. It was so many of our stories. I love it so much. All right, I'm going to read a little passage that I think is, I'm pulling out my glasses because I'm 45. Okay. In the aftermath of the miscarriages and adoption drama, I started to feel uneasy with our church. For one, the more I got involved in activism around social justice, the more uncomfortable I became with some of the church's philosophies around missions and even orphan care. I was beginning to see how some of our well-intended practices as a church were steeped in a lack of understanding of the needs of the people we were trying to serve. Twice I had led teams on mission trips to Africa that in retrospect were really problematic. Now I was learning about the issues inherent in short-term mission trips. I had also been part of a team that visited an orphanage our church built in India that housed hundreds of kids with living parents. And I was learning about the problem of orphanages that essentially entice children away from impoverished but living parents, spending money to clothe and feed kids separate from their families when that money could have been used to keep families together. Around the same time, my views were shifting on issues like women's roles, LGBT inclusion, and politics. I was vocal about these shifting ideas because, well, that's who I am. I was loudly critical when a friend was asked to step down from church leadership because he was gay. I asked questions about the yearly budget, about why more money was spent on full-color glossy handouts and Easter marketing signs than on helping the poor in our community. I pointed out the lack of diversity on the church staff when a third of our town's population was Mexican. When the wife of an elder sent an email forward about Obama being the literal Antichrist to every elder and pastor of the church, and I was the only one who seemed to mind, I knew things were bad. Basically, I was becoming a pain in everyone's ass. In Christian communities, when people start bucking the system, it's easy to attribute their opposition to the church's leadership to one of the three S's: sinfulness, secular ideology, or a slippery slope. For many, my sudden desire to debate these ideas was a sign that I was losing my faith. Their reaction only infuriated me even more because I felt that I was drawing closer to Jesus's actual teachings.
Ooh. what a fascinating experience that must have been to feel like in your own spirit, in your own sort of soul, however you want to describe that, you were drawing closer to, as you said, the teachings of Jesus while experiencing this external de-affirmation of that. God,
It
that's
was
rough.
it was confusing. It was
Yeah.
confusing and disheartening. And I think, and you and I have talked about this before. I think this is where a lot of the hurt stemmed for me, and I think this is true for other people. When I began espousing a different ideology and maybe stepping away from the approved talking points of the evangelical church, right? And pushing back on some of the things that were held very sacred. I felt like my friends found me very scary
Mm-hmm.
because I was pushing back on things they held sacred. And then I felt my friends rejecting me. And it was really hurtful because it felt like they weren't seeing me, as Kristen, as a person that they had we'd walked through hard things together, and I was just a threat to the ideology. And when I wasn't following the ideological line, I was out. I was out. And I mean, it's not like anybody like gave me termination papers, but I could feel people withdrawing. I was not being invited into things. And I knew there was a lot of chatter about me behind my back. Man, Kristen's really gone off the deep end. She's really gone liberal, as if that's one of the biggest insults that you
Thank you.
can
Is
hurl at
what you
someone.
want to say.
Yeah, but I mean, we've
Yeah.
talked about that. I mean, did you
Yeah.
experience that as well? Like, that sort of like um, loss of community, as you step into a different, flavor of faith.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I chronicled this story in more detail in my first book, but I was given papers. I was fired. Now, granted, I was on
Yeah.
staff as a pastor at a mega church down in Arizona, and
Hmm.
when I shifted on specifically LGBTQ inclusion, once the church found that out,
Yeah.
they fired me. And that phenomenon you're describing, where you become a pariah of sorts, it's hard to describe to
Hmm.
people who have not experienced it, because
Yeah.
it's just very confusing to your psyche to be like, I know that nothing has really changed in me
Right.
other than this sort of more expansive
Yeah.
way of thinking about a thing, but
Hmm.
nothing is really, I'm still the same person, and all
Right.
these people that I had built relationships with over years, that looking back now I can see were more like an inch deep and a mile wide,
Hmm.
but at the time I really thought they were true and genuine, to
Yeah.
then suddenly, yeah, feel like they now saw me in an entirely different way just because the authority of the church said that this guy's dangerous.
Hmm.
um, Massively confusing. Now I
Yeah.
can look back on it, and I can have grace and compassion, you know all day long for that perspective, because I understand how scary it is when we were both raised in a system that taught us that the most important thing to God, the creator of the entire world, cares the most about the things that are held up in here, that we have the right
Hmm.
ideas and we hold
Yes.
them with certainty, and that our
Yes.
connection with the divine is dependent upon that.
Yes.
And so when people so I'm thinking about you and how the people in your circle must have seen you smart, educated, seemingly put together, although as a fellow Enneagram 3, I know that to only believe about
Da, 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 da,
10%
da.
of it.
Yeah.
But to have sort of your life put together, and to then have part of it your affirmation of the traditional creeds, you reflected back to them a sense of assuredness that, okay,
Hmm.
my own beliefs aren't too crazy because this person, i.e. Kristen Howerton, also believes them, and so that gives me a sense of
Hmm.
feedback.
Yeah.
Then when you start messing with that,
Right.
that's gonna jack with people's sense. It's gonna stir up all their insecurities of
Yes.
like, well, I maybe want to question that too, Kristen, but we're not allowed to do that. And
Yeah.
because I want to, but I don't want to, I have to have this sort of like relationship with you.
Yeah,
It's
and
hard.
and I mean, like you, I have compassion for it because I think, one of the One of the things that is most difficult is something that you touched on, which is that many of us were raised with this idea that we had to have certainty. And that certainty looked like viewing the Bible as completely inerrant and, you know, and literal. And, and that if you picked apart one or two things that were closely held in that theology, that it was like a house of cards that would fall apart.
Sure.
And so I think the reason that when people make shifts is so threatening, because it was threatening to myself. I felt like I was threatening my own faith, is this idea that if I change my view on something, the whole thing falls apart. That God's no longer real, Jesus is no longer the Son of God. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And like, do you have, as a pastor, do you have advice for people who are starting that shift and holding that fear of like, man, if I disentangle a little bit of this, what if I just lose the whole thing?
Yeah. I try to start in two places. The first I alluded to a minute ago, which is I attempt to move people even to just play with the idea for a minute. You don't have to buy into it. Just play with it. Just go through the thought experiment to imagine that maybe there are things that matter more to God than ideas, than beliefs. That maybe this idea of privileging and prioritizing and saying that a correct belief is the most important thing. I mean, even just think about that in human terms. As a father of four sons, never once do I remember, as my kids were growing up, having the thought that, man, it's really important to me that my sons understand me accurately, know what I do for a living, know what like, what they think about me as it relates to like my identity. It's just not really been on my short list of things that I care about.
Yeah.
And so I invite people, just imagine that maybe there are things that matter more to God than ideas. Especially if, and this might push some people a little too far than they're in the thought experiment, but especially if you begin to consider that the duration of time by which Homo sapiens have walked the planet Earth. Now, I happen to believe the science of evolution is probably more accurate than a young Earth creation model. So that's going to be a couple 100,000 years of Homo sapiens walking Earth. The amount of time in which there was even the capacity for people to have what we now consider to be the correct ideas about God. Like, just think about how many hundreds of thousands of years that information wasn't even available to them. And then even when it was in such a small pocket. Like, even if you were to argue that the ancient Jews had the right ideas about God, such a small pocket of the world, both horizontally and vertically in terms of time and in terms of, so my point is there has to be something that for God is more important or just matters more than ideas. So that's the first move I try to make, is just get people to separate from maybe the things that you believe are not the most important to God. And then the second move I say, and if it helps you, I would invite you to think about Jesus. And I try to point them to these moments in Jesus's ministry in the Gospels where Jesus, by and large, was not really concerned about what people believed about him. He wasn't. Like, for us now as modern Western Christians, that has become like, you got to believe the right thing about Jesus. Whereas Jesus was like, I mean,
so true.
I care more that you believe me, which is to say, believe my teachings, which is to say, believe that love is better than hate, forgiveness is better than revenge, mercy is better than sacrifice. Believe that will lead to life and love and abundance and wholeness. When Jesus, occasionally people might have stumbled upon what we might call a correct answer, which is that Jesus, you are the Messiah, you are the Christ. Every time that happened, Jesus is like, all right, but don't tell anybody. Like, just keep it to yourself. Almost as if to say, that's not the point.
Right.
That's not the point. And yet we build our entire churches on proselytizing and evangelizing, whereas Jesus was like, nah, shut that down. And he even told Peter, yeah, maybe you've got the right answer, but how cool is it that nobody taught you that? It just sort of bubbled up from within you. Anyway, I got a little off track there, but those are the two things I try and help people as they move away from their shift to find some more sense of inner peace, that it's okay to not have the right answers. It's okay to not even have an answer.
Yeah.
Not the point.
And it's hard for people to give themselves that permission, but it's a really beautiful place when you can arrive there. to not have all the answers. All
Yeah.
right, I have one last question for you, and I know that this is something that you address in your book way more extensively. And if, for people who are watching this, who, I get a lot of readers question like, I don't know how to deconstruct my faith, or I'm scared to start, or I don't know what this looks like. You've written a book for those people. You've really written two books for those people. Your previous book, Unclobbered, is so great too. But for those who have that have walked away from a church with a lot of pain, whether that pain is from personal hurts or watching some of the systemic abuses of the church, things like that. How do people begin the healing process so that they are walking away in some wholeness and able to re-engage with their true spirituality as opposed to, being in a place of resentment and pain? How do we start that process of unpacking and healing from church pain?
I think what I'm about to say is merely a perspective, which is to say, this might sound very fitting, and or it might work for some people, and it will not for others. I do not want to pretend what I'm about to say is a universal truth. I do not want people to overestimate my credibility in this, and think that I somehow have a path that is guaranteed to work for them. It's not. So that's my quick disclaimer there. And then I'll say this, because both personally and then anecdotally within the last 6 years of us Kate and I running our church, this has been true over and over and over and over again. So there have been people that have come to Sojourn, and I described, in that excerpt, I read a little bit what this, it happens every single Sunday. There have been people that have come, and when I hear a bit about their stories, and it's oftentimes what you just described, it's not uncommon for me to counsel people to take a break from church. Mm-hmm. Especially if they've sort of, like very quickly moving into like a rebound relationship. It's like, no, just take a break for a bit. Like, it's okay. You don't have to come to church, honestly. Like there's no angry God that becomes now less angry the more often you come to church. Because it's very true that for many people, there's too many triggering aspects in the church experience. And so to whatever degree they could potentially find some healing and wholeness from those wounds, they might just be too raw and too tender for a season. Okay, so that's true for some people. And some people take me up on that, and then they never come back, and they just sort of move on to other ways of finding community, other ways of doing their spiritual journey. And for me, I just say that, bless you in that. That's part of why we named our church Sojourn. We understand that the spiritual life is a series of short stays. And so as long as you might be with us, that's great. The thing that I found really interesting, and I'm actually curious your thoughts on this as a licensed therapist, the thing that I found interesting is that part of the reason why talk therapy works, it's worked for me and it's worked for many people, is that you're in an environment in your therapist's office that is safe, that is non-judgmental. Ideally that it sort of just feeds you unconditional love. And so you can begin to retell traumatic events from your past, which sort of sends your body back into that. You sort of you're reliving that, but you're now receiving, as a result of being in this safe, non-judgmental space, you're now receiving new signals to your brain that can start to rewire the brain and have new emotional responses to those stories.
Yes.
And that's how the healing begins to happen. That's how PTSD begins to become less of a trigger. It's, and I talk about this in the book, but the research shows that vets who come home from war with significant PTSD, they don't heal from that by never revisiting that. They heal from it by going straight into the things that caused them the pain and the triggering. So here's what I've noticed, and what I would say then is, maybe for some people, yeah, you need to stop coming to church. But I think for other people, it's possible that your path to healing from church trauma is by being a part of a church with a safe, non-judgmental presence, where
Yeah.
you can begin to, in a sense, relive some of those old experiences. We had a
Yes.
Sunday a couple of months ago where the words weren't on the screen, and we were meeting in a traditional space for that morning. And somebody just made a joke that maybe the song's in the hymnal. Turns out the song was in the hymnal. And there are people that were like pulling out and singing in a hymnal with pews and stained glass. Half the church wanted to leave because it was so triggering. But there were people afterwards that said, Colby, I can't tell you how healing that was.
Yeah.
Because suddenly there was a lightness to it. Like, oh,
Yeah.
like I would have thought if you would have told me, come to church today, you'll sit in a pew with stained glass and sing from a hymn, no one's going to show up.
Yeah.
But the fact that they could do it in a safe,
Yeah.
non-judgmental, suddenly begins to offer. So this is what I've noticed is
Mm-hmm.
that, and I say this in the book, that for many people who do have very good reasons to never want to come to church again because of their trauma and pain, in conjunction with therapy and other forms of healing, it might very well be that your path towards wholeness is by re-entering into a church space to heal from those unique types of wounds.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, you're rewiring the experience.
Yeah.
You're creating a new story and a new narrative, rather than throwing the whole thing out. And I think a lot of people stay in toxic churches because they're scared of throwing the whole thing out.
Yeah.
And I think, if we can impart any hope to people, it's that you don't have to throw everything out, and you don't have to walk away from the experience of being a Christian or going to church. Like, you can find, I mean, that's the beauty of, where we live and the freedom of expression of religion is there's a church for everybody.
Yeah.
And there are, I mean, we're joking that you have a unicorn church, but they are popping up more and more,
Yep. Yep.
church communities that have a more deconstructed faith or a more progressive theological stance are, they're out there
Yeah.
for people to find. And I think you're right that a lot of that healing can come in just kind of rewiring those pathways and those
Mm.
experiences. Yeah, I like that. All right, well, Kobe, thanks so much for, I feel like you're just dropping so much wisdom on us, and I appreciate it. Your book, The
Thanks, Kristen.
Shift, is out now. It's available now on Amazon and everywhere books are sold. Colby also, if you're not familiar, wrote a book called Unclobbered that is an amazing resource for anyone who is on that journey of figuring out where they are landing theologically with LGBT inclusion. And if they're, wanting to kind of understand how a Christian can still, be following scripture and be LGBT affirming, you really outline that well in that book
Mm.
too. That was really a helpful read for me and for many people I know. So both of those are available everywhere books are sold. Where can people find you online?
You can just Google Colby Martin and you're going to find me. There fortunately aren't that many of us out there, and at Colby Martin on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. So would love to have. And Kristen, I just want to say really quick that I'm so grateful for you and your presence, um, because you do in your writing, in your online community, in your podcast, you hold such tender, precious pastoral space for so many people.
Thank you.
And I can only imagine the number of people that would, as they list off the people who helped them survive their shift, that Kristen freaking Howerton is going to be on that list for so many people. You
Well,
do
thank
really,
you.
really good work. And I'm really glad we're friends.
Me too. Thanks, Colby.
Yeah, thank you.